Let's talk about representations. Representations are very simple. They're affirmations that a borrower must make so that the lender accepts to extend credit to them. For example, I represent that my firm is not solvent, or that it exists, or that we comply with the law. There are usually three major categories of representations. Let's take a look. Let's cover representations. Both representations and warranties are usually generalized as both being representations, and by definition, they are affirmations by the borrower, and possibly not just the borrower, but other parties related to them, such as their warrantors, insurers, or their legal counsel, about multiple aspects of the business. It's, for example, saying, I affirm that the business exists, I affirm that we have no outstanding debt, or I affirm that we have this outstanding debt, and so on. There are three main types of representations that are important in loan agreements. The first are financial representations. These are related to taxes, litigation, solvency, cash flow, material adverse clauses, and so on. It's affirming I've paid all my taxes, we have no pending litigation, and so on. The next category are business representations. These are related to aspects of the business. It's saying we have the rights to this IP, we have this capitalization table, we have these subsidiaries, we have these labor or employee issues, or we don't, hopefully, or these are the properties that we have, characteristics of the business itself. And then legal representations. These have to do with legal characteristics of the borrower or the agreement itself. So related to the borrower, it's things such as stating the company exists, the company is properly established, and so on. Representations related to the agreement have to do with affirming that the agreement is legally valid or it's enforceable, and so on. These are important in the case where the lender has to take remedial action, so they need this representation of the borrower stating, I recognize that this credit agreement is legally valid, which in a way makes them consent to what the lender wants to do. So first, financial representations have to do with the financial status of the borrower, naturally, as well as issues of taxes, litigation, and other possible ones. Common types include financial statements and pro forma statements. These are usually requested and they must be compliant with the generally accepted accounting principles. So pro forma statements are usually projections, for example, for acquisitions, of how the company will be after the acquisition is consummated, how the business will change. Financial statements themselves can both be past ones and future projections. And out of curiosity, borrowers are usually a lot more reluctant to provide representations for future projections because they don't want to affirm anything that can change. Then we have material adverse event representations as well as tax and litigation representations. These are usually related. So it's proving that there are no material adverse changes to the company, also known as the MAC clause, which stands for Material Adverse Clause, and for example, that there is no litigation that can cause a material event. It's important to state that this includes present litigation or not, so hypothetical. So even if there is no real lawsuit against the company, but there is a possible one, the representations will include the possible one as well. Unpaid taxes can also result in material events, and they also need to be disclosed, because regardless of the value, the government collection process can be very harmful to the company, and it can result in losing licenses or even liquidating the company. And finally, solvency representations. So this is assuring that the company is solvent. This may seem basic, but it never hurts to request it. Then we have representations about the business, and these focus on specific details of the business activity that are important. They may include, first, capitalization representations, affirming who owns interest in the company, what's the number of shares outstanding, what number of shares can be further issued, and so on. Then, subsidiaries and investments. Whether the borrower company contains subsidiaries or not, what are the restrictions between the subsidiary and the parent, such as providing dividends to one another or paying off the debt of one another, and whether subsidiaries can pay dividends to the parent company, for example. If the debt agreement is for a subsidiary and they pay dividends to the parent, that can be a problem. Then, property. Which properties the company actually possesses and which will be used as collateral, office space, factories, or others. Then, employee matters. So this is disclosing collective bargaining situations or disputes with employees, especially if they involve planned actions such as strikes or others that may be material to the business. This is important because if you're in the middle of negotiating and there's a massive strike in the borrower's workforce, that can have severe financial impact, and it can be a material adverse event. Then IP, standard practice, affirming that the business owns the patents, the trademarks, or the rights, and so on. And last but not least, environmental issues, affirming that there are no environmental issues because these can result in heavy costs or sanctions for the company, and they can even possibly represent violations of the law. And finally, we have legal representations. As mentioned, these affirm that the business complies with the law, both in terms of being established, but also in terms of its ongoing operations. So first, we have representations of organization, existence, power, and qualification to do business. These four may seem complex, but they usually come as one, and they're essential elements. They're kind of different faces of the same thing, and they're usually requested as one single package. So in short, organization means that the company was properly incorporated or organized. Existence means that the entity still exists. This sounds basic, but you would be surprised that some companies go bankrupt while the loan is being negotiated and don't disclose it. Then, power, that the company has the power to incur in this debt. So, authorization from a senior officer. And finally, qualification to the business, that the company has the legal right to perform their business activity. They may need permits, licenses, or other documents. Then we have two similar principles that are not related to the business, but they're related to the agreement: due authorization and due execution. These are about the agreement itself. They affirm that the agreement was authorized and that it's properly executed without mistakes or inaccuracies. Then, related ones are legal validity and enforceability of the agreement, as well as representations of no conflicts, whether with the law or other credit agreements. So the borrower is representing that they recognize that the document is legally valid and that the lender can enforce it, as well as stating that it doesn't have any conflict that can invalidate the agreement, whether with the law or with previous lenders. This is important because if the lender is committing a violation by lending this money, they want a piece of paper from the borrower that states, I affirm that there's not a conflict, and that's why the lender loaned the money in the first place. Then we have other miscellaneous ones, such as legal compliance, anti-bribery measures, anti-terrorism measures, and so on. It's pretty much affirming that the business is conducting itself properly. Representations serve two main purposes. The first is that they're necessary components of the actual mechanics of lending. What I mean is that lack of representations can be considered enough grounds to actually refuse a loan. If a lender requests a representation that the company exists and that it doesn't owe taxes to the IRS, for example, and the borrower doesn't provide them, well, there's something fishy there. Then, if after the agreement is in place, the lender finds out that the representations are false, This will result in a default, which can cause acceleration of the loan or other remedial action. So a false representation is exactly the same as not paying in terms of default, or it can even be more serious. So that's the first major purpose. It's a due diligence mechanism in a way. The second major purpose is that they provide exculpation and insulation to lenders. In other words, they allow a lender to say, hey, I only loaned the money because the borrower affirmed that they were legal, they existed, and so on. So it's not our fault. This is because there may be multiple situations where the business doesn't comply with the law, and this can be a problem for both the borrower and the lender, naturally, or even the loan itself. The borrower may be legally forbidden from taking on more debt, so the agreement itself can be breaking the law. So in these cases, the representations by the borrower serve as a confirmation that the lender did their due diligence, so their exposure is eliminated, or at least it's mitigated, because they're saying, we took these precautions and we trusted their word. What are some examples of representations? The first are acquisitions. If the financing is for an acquisition, there are several representations that change, such as what will be the effect of the acquisition on a collective bargaining agreement, for example, whether employees are going to be paid or whether this is going to deteriorate into a legal dispute, or the financial statements, pro forma. So modeling how the company will be like after the purchase. For example, if a healthy company is buying another company that has a lot of problems, the lenders want to know that beforehand because that can be a showstopper. Then, individuals versus corporations. A lot of what we're mentioning is for companies, but individuals also borrow. So in the case of individuals, many representations are not necessary or they're simplified. For example, organization representations don't make sense for an individual, nor existence representations, maybe just a statement that the individual is alive. Or other ones, such as subsidiaries representations, don't make sense. Then, counsel opinions. In certain representations, such as the ones related to the legal status of the entity and the affirmations that there are no material adverse events, not only does the borrower provide a representation themselves, but their legal counsel may provide an opinion as well. Usually, the lenders want this. But what's funny here is that these are also negotiated and there are multiple variations, because everybody wants to limit their exposure. So the legal counsel will not provide an opinion that states that the business is not breaking the law, but they may provide a kind of conditional opinion saying, to the best of our knowledge, or to the best of our current knowledge, they are not breaking the law. But the more that these statements and opinions are conditional, the less that they actually protect the lender. So there's a lot of negotiation here as well, and every party is trying to protect themselves, naturally. What are our key takeaways here? The first is that there are three major types of representations: legal, about the legal status of the borrower; an agreement, financial, about the financial conditions or taxes or solvency; and business ones, regarding specific details such as properties, IP, and so on. Then, legal representations in specific have to do with the business being formed, existing, being allowed to operate, as well as the agreement itself being legally valid and with no conflicts. Then, financial representations. They have to do with the entity being compliant with the generally accepted accounting principles, not being solvent, not having material tax or litigation issues, and so on. Then, business representations. These have to do with specific issues of the business, such as the cap table, the properties held, issues with employees, subsidiaries, the environment, or others. And finally, remember, representations have two major purposes. The first is a kind of due diligence purpose. either to invalidate a loan or cause a default, but the other purpose is to mitigate exposure and insulate a lender in case the worst happens. So as we see, these representations need to be made by the borrower so that the lender accepts to extend credit to them. They're usually legal, financial, and about the specifics of the business itself.